fateful error of American policy in the entire post-Cold War era. So the most fateful error, right? The other quote that I would like to use to start this discussion is by one of your lecturers who spoke a couple of days ago, and he is the director of Carnegie Moscow, Dmitry Trenin. He says that the fundamental error of Russian foreign policy since the mid-1990s has been the fixation on the problem of NATO expansion. So one person believes it is the most fateful error of US foreign policy, and the Russian scholar believes that it's the most fundamental error of Russian foreign policy to get so fixated on NATO expansion. So what is it? And why is NATO expansion so controversial? And I think we will talk more about it in question and answer session. I would like to recommend a couple of things if you're interested in this issue that you can look at. Obviously, the electronic briefing books that I put on the readings in your website. I hope you look at them because we collected really very interesting documents, very revealing documents that show the hopes, the expectations, and the plans on both sides. But also there are some books you might want to consult. I think the single most important book to understand the NATO expansion is by James Goldgeier. The title of the book is not Whether, but When. And this book came out pretty long ago in the early 2000s. He was the first person to look at this issue. And the amazing thing about that research is that the decision to expand NATO was such an unlikely decision. When Goldgeier interviewed members of the Clinton administration, 95% of his interviewees at the time were against the expansion. 95% of the Clinton administration members were against the expansion. The two secretaries of defense, Les Aspin and Bill Perry, were against the expansion. Strobe Talbot initially was against the expansion. But in the end, the decision was made and NATO was expanded. So here shows the process, how this initially very unpopular decision over the opposition of the administration, over the opposition of most of the allies, but with deep and pretty passionate commitment by the president, became the reality in the mid-1990s. So we will take it a little bit earlier. We will take a step back to 1990. We mentioned it in our previous lecture about the summits. And here I would recommend looking at Mary Sarotti's book, 1989, when she is showing a wide-ranging debate in Europe in 1989, 1990 about the future of Europe. What were the visions of Europe? And if you look in 1989 and early 1990, again, even the existence of NATO, let alone expansion of NATO, was seen as a very iffy proposition because it seemed like the world was changing, and so the military blocs will also change or even dissolve. And one last article that I would love to mention, and I will add it to the reading list, is by Joshua Shifrinson about the promises that the United States made explicitly or implicitly to the Soviets regarding the expansion of NATO. And you probably heard that there is a big debate about, were there promises, were there assurances, were they broken, were they not broken, and who gave them? So very quickly, I will restate what I said in the previous lecture. Gorbachev had this vision of Europe called the common European home. So what it means is that now that the United States and the Soviet Union were no longer enemies, and the Soviet Union was transforming into a democratic new union, there was no place for confrontational military blocs. So these military blocs will gradually become political, then they will dissolve, and they would give their functions, again, over years, right, to CSC. CSC is Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. It was established in 1975 with the signing of the Helsinki Final Act, and it existed as a series of conferences. So in Gorbachev's vision, this was the integrative structure. It will become stronger, it will assimilate the functions of the blocs. And why was it so good? Because this organization already contained all the European countries and the United States and Canada and the Soviet Union. So this was already a functioning integrational structure, and he wanted to continue on that basis. It seemed that for a long time, a lot of European leaders and East European dissidents shared that view because they were wary of US dominance in Europe. East European dissidents and a lot of East European new leadership, especially Václav Havel, believed that all foreign troops should go home. And there were some very strong assurances given by the Western leaders, not just by Baker, not just by Bush, to Gorbachev, that if Gorbachev agrees to German unification and NATO, basically if he agrees that NATO will exist and become stronger with the addition of East Germany and United Germany, then NATO will transform because there will be this new era in Europe. So while Gorbachev argued for his common European home, while agreeing with German unification, he had a couple of very revealing exchanges with his American partners. In May 1990, he talked with Jim Baker in Moscow. And when Gorbachev again returned to his idea of the pan-European movement and pan-European security structures and common European home, Baker said a very interesting thing. He said, well, your common European home is a wonderful dream, but it's a dream. And NATO exists. NATO is a reality. And then that was very characteristic of kind of the US attitude. Why should we build something new when we have a structure that's already working? But to kind of soften the unification process for Gorbachev, they agreed to include his vision of common European home in the London NATO communique, which was passed in July 1990, saying exactly that NATO will transform, there will be a new NATO, and the European security structures will be built. But the decision-making within the Bush administration went in a way that said, you know, really, CSC and the European structures, they are a threat to the American role in Europe, and by that, to the American role globally. NATO is really the anchor of US presence and US influence in European affairs, on the one hand. On the other hand, there were a lot of members in the Bush administration who said, you know, these Europeans, they can't take care of themselves. As soon as America withdraws, they tend to get into really major conflicts. Look, World War I, World War II, and we don't want to withdraw now to then be pulled back in some of their conflicts. It's better to stay and keep peace in Europe. So by the end of 1990, the sense in the Bush administration was NATO's important, NATO is our anchor, and whatever nice words we say about the European structures, we will treat the NATO and NATO structures as most important, because that is the key to our global role. The question that many people asked us, would Bush, the elder, enlarge NATO if he won the second presidency? And it's a really interesting question, because it's one of those if missed opportunity, maybe, we don't know, it's hard to say, but it looks like maybe he would not have enlarged that, because he had 4 years in power left, and his legacy was already as the president who more or less saved NATO by helping Germany unite in NATO. Now, I will mention a couple of things here that I would call the intervening variables. So we have planning and thinking going on both in the Soviet Union, later in Russia, right? And in the US. But apart from what they are planning and thinking, there are things that's happening. And the first intervening variable was Yugoslavia. The wars in Yugoslavia began threatening the European peace and the European security in a way that was not anticipated. The dissolution of the Soviet Union was going rather peacefully, but in 1991, we have the beginning of real cruel conflicts in Yugoslavia, and the Europeans did not know how to deal with them. In fact, some European countries like Germany began giving recognition to parts of now split Yugoslavia, thus kind of exacerbating already beginning military conflict. So while Europe is split about what to do in Yugoslavia and kind of paralyzed by its disagreements, the United States see a possibility, maybe a chance, to redefine the NATO mission and to bring peace to Yugoslavia. It's kind of like it almost is this phenomenon that supports the argument of those people in the Bush administration, like Cheney, who are saying, well, you know, these Europeans, they can't take care of themselves. So look what's going on again. So this is why NATO has to stay. This is NATO's role. But Yugoslavia is not a member of NATO, right? Nobody has been attacked. So they start thinking about NATO's new role as a peacekeeper. And there's a new concept that's being added. It's called out of area operations, which means, you know, it really is not NATO's territory and nobody has been attacked, but it's Europe and there is a need for peacekeeping. And this is where NATO countries and non-NATO countries could cooperate. Along the same time, there is another very interesting intervening variable. The East Europeans, now new regimes in power for 1 or 2 years, they see what's going on and they gradually redefine their views of the European future. They see where the wind blows and where their future lies. They disband the Warsaw Pact in March 1991. It's been basically defunct since the German unification, but now it formally disbands, and there is no organization of the East. So rather than creating something else, they realized that their best bet is to join Western organizations, which is the beginning of the European Union, which is their top priority, and NATO. In this sense, the most interesting evolution is one of Václav Havel, the president of New Czechoslovakia, and then later after the Velvet Divorce of the Czech Republic. In early 1990, he comes to Washington and he gives a powerful speech in Congress calling for dissolution of both pacts, saying New Europe is not a place for military organizations. Without naming it, he essentially repeats Gorbachev's vision. And he asks the Americans to bring their boys home. And you know what happens? Congress gets up, and at that moment, when he asks to bring American boys home, people applaud to this proposal. Well, after that, President Bush expressed his surprise and his disappointment with Havel calling for dissolution of NATO and removal of the US forces. And he gave Havel a little lecture explaining why NATO is important, including important to the security of Eastern Europe. So that is another slight change that contributed greatly to later decision. Decision, of course, comes much later. And before the decision to expand NATO is reached in the United States, there is this very interesting period when the Yeltsin administration comes to power. So the Soviet Union falls apart, and Yeltsin, as the new leader of Russia, independent Russia, wants pretty much to follow Gorbachev's foreign policy, even though they were such personal enemies, political enemies. They had very different positions on the economic reform, on many issues of domestic politics. In foreign policy, Yeltsin's foreign policy is essentially the continuation of Gorbachev's foreign policy. And Yeltsin and people around him are initially concerned about possible NATO expansion. So they send delegations to NATO, and delegations report back that they meet with various NATO officials, including Secretary Werner, Manfred Werner, who says, no, we are not thinking of expanding NATO. Werner says to Yeltsin's delegation, I am personally against it. And in fact, the absolute majority, he says 13 out of 16 members of NATO are against expansion. So these delegations come home, report that to Yeltsin, say, well, no worries, nobody's thinking about expansion. And for these 2 to 3 years, from 1990 to early 1993, there is a certain honeymoon between Russia and NATO. And I recently studied this issue in the Russian archives. I really did not anticipate to find that there were so many joint events, delegations, that the Russians participated in NATO assembly, that top officials of NATO came to Russia all the time, met with top parliamentary leaders, with Yeltsin, with members of the administration, and everything was great. They talked about cooperation, they talked about Yugoslavia, they talked about, future integration, security integration of Europe. So this is unexpected, but in a way, it makes sense, because before NATO started enlarging, Russians were not concerned. They accepted the fact that NATO will stay. So what happens on the other side of the ocean is that the new Clinton administration comes to power, and it does not come to power with a goal to expand NATO. It's not a part of early conversations within the administration or electoral problem, not at all. But in the spring of 1993, the leaders of East European countries come to Washington for the opening of the new Holocaust Museum. And during those meetings, they tell Clinton that it would be nice to integrate Eastern Europe, really integrate Eastern Europe in major European institutions. And they would have preferred to be integrated in the European Union, but the European Union was not taking them yet. So the fastest way to be integrated seemed to be through NATO. What's interesting is that at that point, they did not argue on the basis of a Russian threat. They did not say, oh, look, you know, maybe with the exception of Poland. Lech Wałęsa, the Polish leader at the time, did say that, you know, you can never trust the bear. You can never trust the bear. You have to keep the bear in the cage. But other people said, no, you should not isolate Russia. Things will only get worse in Europe if you isolate Russia. Russia has to be integrated too. But they all argued for not being left behind, not being left in limbo, in the zone between the new Europe that was integrating and Russia that was deeply mired in crisis. So within the Clinton administration, there were several people who believed very passionately that NATO should be expanded. But they did not quite think that there is this Russian threat yet. They believed that Russia was democratizing. And in fact, they very genuinely, most of them, believed that the United States could and should help Russia with its democratic reform. But they saw expansion of NATO, and Tony Lake was the biggest proponent, and the National Security Advisor. He was the biggest proponent of expansion of NATO on the grounds that joining NATO would guarantee and ensure the democratic reform in those new states. So they saw expansion of NATO not as an expansion of a security alliance, but as an expansion of the zone of democracy. They believe that with NATO, if those countries are willing and interesting to make that choice, they will also kind of cement their democratic choice. And so that made sense. Now, another surprising discovery is that in the internal documents of the Clinton administration, you see that they did not really exclude Russia. There is a very famous memorandum of the summer of 1993 written by Lynn Davis, which proposes a timetable for NATO enlargement. And it envisions Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus joining NATO in 2005. So on the one hand, they saw it as just kind of, you know, this democratic expansion. On the other hand, some members of the administration were also, you know, kind of in the back of their heads, they were still under the shadow of the Cold War stereotypes. And they thought, well, it would be nice if we had this NATO as a hedge against the possibility that Russia would go bad. Well, okay. They probably did not realize what a strong opposition would emerge in Russia to the expansion. And this opposition emerged very early on. Even though Russia never took any actual action to push back on NATO expansion, the NATO expansion issue was the single issue in the 1990s on which there was a consensus in the entire political elite and the population. Even as Russia was struggling with economic reform, split into factions, forming, you know, 100 or so parties, even through the armed conflict between Yeltsin and the parliament, the only one issue they agreed on, all of the factions, was that NATO expansion would be harmful to the Russian interests. So some people in the Clinton administration understood it and were warning the president that he should not speed up the expansion. Like I said, the majority in the administration were against the expansion in general, but also especially against the speedy expansion. When when Yeltsin went to Poland in August 1993, the issue of NATO expansion was raised openly, and Lech Walesa argued on the basis of the Helsinki Final Act, which stipulated that every country was free to join any alliance that it wanted. He asked Yeltsin directly, and Yeltsin said, of course, we cannot object against your right to join any organization that you want. That was immediately presented as, well, Yeltsin just said, go ahead to Polish membership in NATO. That in itself led to very big recriminations within the Russian political spectrum and to attacks against Yeltsin as, you know, giving away this Russian, maybe not right, but Russian chance to prevent the expansion. Was there such chance? Probably there wasn't. While Yeltsin was trying in letters, in direct conversations, to plead essentially with Clinton not to expand, explaining that not just the moderate opposition, but the political elite and the country were against this decision. And this decision would play to strengthen the hand of the Russian conservatives. Clinton genuinely believed that he would be able to persuade Yeltsin that NATO would expand, but it would not be an expansion against the Russian interest. Within the Clinton administration, the strongest opponents of fast expansion were around Bill Perry, Secretary of Defense. And in the Pentagon, they came up with a very interesting alternative. The alternative that now most do not know about, because it kind of was never full-fledged. It never, the alternative was called Partnership for Peace. Partnership for Peace was supposed to be inclusive. Partnership for Peace was open for anybody to join. And the idea was that the Partnership for Peace would be in place for that period of time between now, 1993, and sometime in the future when NATO would expand. But meanwhile, all the countries in Europe, including Russia, could be part of this partnership. And in the partnership, they will learn to work together with Western security institutions, with NATO, and the main on peacekeeping. Now, a couple of words about the Clinton administration priorities with Russia and on Yeltsin's administration priorities with the United States. So was very committed to the Russian reform. In terms of personal commitment to Russian reform, to the success of the Russian Democrats, you know, it's probably impossible to compare him to any American president. And the best book to read about that is by Strobe Talbot. It's called The Russia Hand. And everybody thinks it's Strobe Talbot, who was Deputy Secretary of Defense, responsible for Russian newly independent states. But actually it is about Clinton, because Clinton literally thought about Russia and the fates of Russian democracy every day. Very good, but Clinton also had other priorities, and that was the problem. The problem was that there were several priorities that involved Russia, including his political priorities, arms control. the future of Europe, and ultimately his legacy. Arms control was a very strong administration. They needed unfinished arms control agreements from the Bush era, START 2, and then go on to START, the issue of anti-ballistic missile defense, and a very important issue of denuclearizing former Soviet republics of Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus. For that, they needed Yeltsin. They needed Yeltsin to stay in power. They needed to negotiate with Yeltsin, because if opposition came to power, it was unlikely that these priorities would be fulfilled. Now, on part of Yeltsin, Yeltsin still believed that he inherited a superpower. But the real difference between the Gorbachev period and was the leader of Russia is that there was no superpower. The Soviet Union was a superpower who, in voluntary or forceful way, held its word in practically every global conflict. Russia was a power that lost its military bloc, lost its organization of economic integration of East European countries, and it was dealing with very acute economic and identity conflicts. And here comes another intervening variable. This country that saw itself as democratic, right, in the process of democratic reform, by the fall of 1993, found itself in a military confrontation between the president and the parliament. And this is a very important issue for the NATO discussion, because this is really a turning point where people looked at what's going on in Russia and said, well, is it really going to be a democracy? So when Yeltsin shelled his own parliament, disbanded the constitutional court, and banned the Communist Party for a short period of time, constitutional court ruled against it, and then called new elections and a referendum on a constitution which gave him essentially super presidential powers, many people in the West had to confront the issue. They still need Yeltsin there, and his opposition does not look very good. They look more communist, more nationalist, but Yeltsin is the only person we can deal with. So he's using very undemocratic methods, but he is the only one who can deliver on our priorities. The decision to actually expand NATO over dealing with building partnership for peace was made in early 1994, but clearly a big role in that decision was this factor of where is Russia going? And people lost the complete confidence that Russia was going to become a democracy. This crisis and the military resolution of the crisis scared a lot of people around the world, and primarily it scared East Europeans. After the constitutional crisis, as it was called, East Europeans realized that these people can come to power in Russia. If even the top Russian Democrats are using artillery against the parliament, what would the communists do, or nationalists, if they come to power? And now they felt genuinely insecure, and they appealed to the United States now more powerfully on the grounds of security to become NATO members. The Clinton administration, as I said, was still believing, still confident that they could persuade Yeltsin by offering him many other payoffs if Yeltsin accepted NATO expansion, or at least if Yeltsin accepted not so much NATO expansion, but if at least he could swallow it and not talk publicly negatively about it. So in October 1993, a very high-level US delegation came to Russia explaining to Yeltsin the benefits of the partnership, and very confusingly said that the Partnership for Peace was the alternative to NATO expansion, and that now they all will be working on the Partnership for Peace, and NATO will be somewhere out there in the future. And Yeltsin completely agreed to that. He actually said, well, this is brilliant. This is a stroke of genius. Tell Bill that our partnership will grow and grow. Bill Clinton came to Moscow a little later in January and said, the Partnership for Peace is the real thing now. NATO expansion will happen, but will happen in the future. When Clinton came to Moscow in May 1995 for the summit on the Victory Day, the 50th anniversary of the victory in World War II, he and Yeltsin achieved a deal, an understanding, where they both wanted to be reelected. And they understood that the issue of NATO was a very hot issue that could undermine them both in the elections. So the deal was that Clinton will not agree to NATO expansion, will not encourage NATO expansion, or even speak about it much publicly until after the Russian election of 1996. In return, Yeltsin will not publicly object to NATO expansion until that time and will sign the Partnership for Peace. And that was the deal that both sides kept. Yeltsin was reelected in 1996, and so was Clinton. And then the road to NATO expansion was open. There was another major effort in 1997 to persuade the Russians to agree to NATO expansion. By that time, the deal was essentially done. The Russians understood that NATO would expand no matter what, and they just were refusing to swallow it. They were refusing to sit quietly, and especially the opposition. So in 1996, 1997, the biggest single faction in the Russian Duma, in the parliament, was called the Anti-NATO Caucus. This is very unusual for the Russian parliament because in all these factions and groups, again, this was the only group that united people from all kinds of factions, except from the Yabloko party. But all they could do is express discontent. And this discontent and this opposition did not produce any practical results. So in 1997, NATO at its Madrid summit gave invitations to the first group of countries to join NATO. Hungary, Czech Republic, and Poland would be the first members, and they joined NATO as full members in 1999 as a gesture toward Russia, saying, okay, well, there will be tension, but at the same time, there will be a new upgrade Russia-NATO relationship. They signed a NATO-Russia charter, and a host of programs opened with the top office in Moscow and regional universities, which represented NATO. However, even that little improvement of relations between Russia and NATO after the first invitation to the new group of members was completely shattered by the fact that when the new members joined in early March 1999, by the end of March 1999, another major intervening variable happened, and that was the first operation of the new NATO, which was called Operation Allied Force, which was the bombing of Yugoslavia after strenuous objections by Russia and after Russian efforts to mediate then were rejected by NATO. So Russia felt betrayed because they felt that now Russia is out of Europe. And NATO, which was proclaiming itself to be a peaceful consultative organ, which would consult with Russia on security issues, used its alliance as a very first, very symbolic gesture against a Russian ally in Europe without consulting or even notifying Russia. So I will end here with the first round of NATO expansion. If you have questions about the second round of NATO expansion and Putin's position on that, and we can talk about that. But I think that this first round of NATO expansion against very strong opposition from Russia, kind of fulfilling the bad prophecy that Russia will be isolated and new lines will be drawn in Europe, I think it's a good place to end. And I just wanted to quote President Gorbachev, what he said in 2014 when he was asked about NATO expansion. Oh, you know, I won't take time. I will quote him, but I right now lost the quote.